a lot of this now. It's just that repetition, that engagement, and taking the effort.
But still in North America today, and I think particularly of some of my experiences of speaking in the United States, there's a minority group of one of their parties that likes to emphasize the fact that science is just opinion.
Yeah.
And opinion is equal no matter what the source is.
Yeah.
And public policy relates to ideology, and therefore what we're really talking about is ideology, which they then try to bring back to be the principal focus here. And I don't wish to get into a kind of scientific determinism here in terms of looking at public policy questions. But I do think one of the difficulties we have here in North America is there has been at times a lack of respect for the nature of the scientific debate that's going on, and trying to take from that the policy lessons that may. And I want to say, I mean, I love some of the comments that Preston Manning, who is the Manning think tank here in Calgary, a right-wing organization. Preston always likes to take people back to the Greek root of the word conservative, meaning conservation. Yeah. And so I'm not trying to make a party point here, because I think they're on both sides, but I do think in the current frame of mind in North America, there is a visible minority who are making things different for full acceptance of science. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's fair, but it's new, you know. I mean, I remember reading Silent Spring, and which was so formative on me, you know, and reading about Rachel Carson's life. I mean, her life was made hell by the chemical companies for doing that. They slandered her. They said she was a communist, a lesbian, or whatever, you know, they could throw at her. And that went on for decades, and her reputation still suffers a bit from that, you know, that stuff, even though she's an absolute environmental hero. So I think that, you know, we're in a really rough and tumble area here where you know, the other side doesn't have any scientific credibility, so they would use every other trick they can to keep things going their way. But I guess I just have a really fundamental view that truth will out in the end, you know. And there's some people whose minds will never change. They might be 5 or 10% of the population, but most people at the end of the day are pretty reasonable. Yeah. You know, and if you can get away from the politics and get away from the ideology and just give people information so they can make up their own minds, I think it's the best you can do. I mean, in a society like ours, the only safeguard of our democracy is an informed public. We have to have that.
Well, I love Elizabeth May's claim that Brian Mulroney was the greatest environmental prime minister that Canada ever had, which was a way of bridging some of that, I think, in connection with it. I want to move on now to the international sphere, and we've gone through a very depressing situation. I spent a great deal of time, did a number of other people in the room here, on Kyoto delegations and Kyoto negotiations and other things in connection with this. I think we still have a fundamental impasse internationally in terms of looking at a successor to Kyoto. I think Kyoto itself is now gone. But it seems to me that because emissions move across borders so frequently, whether it's Mexico, US, Canada, or Europe, or wherever it is, that irrespective of the difficulties in the past, somehow we've got to find some common language, some common assumptions between the developing world and the developed world, and between Europe and North America, to begin to get some kind of viable international agreement which will be commercially viable as well as scientifically viable.
Yeah, look, I agree with you. And what we see with those international agreements is that the UNFCCC process, for those who know, that's the kind of big negotiations, to broker a global treaty, they continue, and they're having slow incremental success. But you know, it's a painfully slow process. We're now up to what, COP20 or something? It's going to be, we're right up there. It's been going a long time.
It always reminds me of my age and the number of COPs we've now gone into.
Exactly. But you know, at COP15 in Copenhagen, despite the fact that expectations weren't met for the public, something very important was achieved, which was that Copenhagen Accord, where individual nations set targets for themselves. And so progress is being made in that area. Now we know that is not enough. that the total volume of abatement that the Copenhagen Accord offers is only about half of what we need to avoid dangerous climate change. So we've got to work harder at that. But in addition to that, we're now seeing some really interesting bilateral work being done between China and the US.
Oh, yes.
Between them are probably between 40 and 45% of global emissions, you know. And as I said, I was in China for 2 months at a time when Todd Stern from the US was there negotiating things. And one of the interesting things in this area is, you know, if the US president and the Chinese president get together, there's a number of things they can't talk about. It's hard. Free trade's hard, right?
Right.
Like human rights is hard, right?
Right.
But climate change actually is one of the easier subjects. They've both got a common interest in dealing with this. And so there is a bilateral approach building there, I think, which is starting very cautiously, and you know, to do with HFCs was the first announcement they made. But I have no doubt there's an intent to influence the 2015 meetings, because where the US and China goes, the world has to follow. And China's self-interest is very patent. I mean, they want to be the manufacturing capital for clean energy technologies for the planet. And in fact, they already are for solar. So.
Well, the ISO 14000 series that I chair out of Geneva, one of the real lessons that came home to me so clearly is one, in the ISO 14000 series, and we have an ISO 14001, we have over 255,000 companies worldwide now externally compliant. And the Chinese are by far the most active player.
Yeah.
They understand better than anyone else the difference between standards and trade issues.
Yeah.
They link the two so nicely together that they're today in China building labs all over China related to standards, so that within 5 to 10 years, their products will be meeting international standards in connection with us. And I find this fascinating. One, because they seem to be ahead of us in understanding the linkage between environment and future trade.
Yeah.
And secondly, in connection with it, the way in which they see environment and innovation from a technology point of view important in terms of their 5 and 10 and 15-year plans out in connection with it. But I find this really encouraging. The degree to which some companies here in Calgary have caught on to this, some European companies have as well, and the way in which we're going to be seeing then environment to a far greater extent seen as then a condition for market access. That instead of it being a cost factor just in terms of your local production, it's a means of getting into markets, whether or not it's the Keystone XL pipeline questions in the US, whether it's a variety of others in connection with it right now. So I do see some encouraging aspects right now in terms of the linkage between economics and environment, which may help to push us forward in the future.
Yeah, look, that is so true. I think it's a critical point we often miss. And, you know, when you think about a lot of people say, I don't give a damn about a reputation. We're just going to dig the stuff up and ship it off.
Yeah.
But in fact, reputation costs. I mean, at the worst case scenario is you lose your social license to operate. And we've seen that with some industries like asbestos and so forth, you know. But there's a lower level where you've lost, your reputation has been tarnished, and so it just becomes harder to do things like the pipeline and whatever, you know.
Yes.
And that represents a real cost. You can monetize that in time and value. It actually does have a real cost. So reputation is tremendously important, I think. And you're right, that you're linking environmental outcomes with trade is going to be, I think, important in future. I mean, it already is in a de facto way, but it's going to be more important.
Certainly one of the areas of debate we have in Alberta right now, given a recent event, is the whole issue of the public's right to be accessed, to be involved in decision-making in connection with major new energy projects, in particular in connection with it. And it seems to me right now, the Alberta government and companies and the NGOs are all having some difficulty defining this when they get beyond principles. And so one of the challenges, I think, for regulatory authorities and others right now is to come forward with clear principles. 25 years ago, Tom Berger laid down a principle which I wished was quoted more frequently when they challenged him on the role of NGOs to participate in he was doing equivalent to the Ranger inquiry in Australia. He was doing it on Northern Pipelines here. And Tom said, environmental NGOs don't represent the public interest, but the public interest is only achieved when they are participating. I thought it was a kind of interesting balancing of things in connection with it. And I think this is a really serious policy issue right now, both at the federal level with our joint panels on major projects, federal, interprovincial, and international, and also here in Alberta. And it carries over as well into our First Nation issues in connection with it. So I was just wondering, in terms of Australia, are you running into some of the same issues in connection with how the public, or have you passed over that and your processes are socially acceptable to a degree you've seemed to find a balance?
I wish we were there. We aren't really. I mean, oh God, politics always tends to obfuscate things and twist them, and it becomes very difficult. You know, our last election is a great example. You know, we had the first minority government in Australia since the Second World War.
Right.
That led to all sorts of difficulties. There was disunity in the principal party. But then our more conservative side of politics started a campaign which was very focused on the carbon tax in Australia. And really used that as a rallying cry to try to bring down the government. They didn't succeed in bringing on an early election, so the thing ran the full 3 years. And by the time the election came, the carbon tax issue was very hollow as an issue because we'd already had it for 18 months. People knew it wasn't going to break the bank. The economy continued to prosper, you know, was continued to grow, and energy prices weren't being, you know, as affected as people said they would by it. So it was a non-issue in a way. So it's such a difficult thing. I mean, while politics is involved in energy policy and so forth, I think you're facing an uphill battle. It's really tough. Mm-hmm. So, you know, but those NGOs, the public voice, how do you get that into, how do you inject that into the debate? Mm-hmm. Boy, that's hard work.
Because I think right now, we're seeing in Canada, and I don't know if this is your case as well, we're seeing a variety of ways in which the budgets of think tanks, be they publicly funded ones or external, the way in which scientists are being questioned by some levels of government in connection with their right to publicly represent their views in regulatory or other forums. And we're seeing the way in which then there is a constricting of the sources of reliable information for a kind of properly dynamic democratic process. I'm exaggerating a little here, but we've seen a series of these events here in Canada. The the Experimental Lakes Research Station in Northern Ontario being the latest. But anyway, are you seeing some of that in Australia?
Well, yeah, I mean, the example of the Climate Commission is a good one. You know, the new Conservative government came to power 3 weeks ago, roughly. First act was to close down the Climate Commission because we're an information body. They, for one reason or other, didn't want that. And they took down the website the day that, with all our reports on it and things, the day they formed the new cabinet. But we're a pretty bolshy people, and myself and the other commissioners, you know, we got together and said, well, you know, we don't reckon this is good enough. You know, we think there's still a job to be done.
Yes.
And we got a massive tsunami of supportive emails.
Right.
So we thought, well, we'll start up a non-for-profit company and just continue doing exactly the same thing. And I was so surprised because we set this company up, and within 5 days we'd raised $1 million from small donations from ordinary Australians. You know,
can I just...
It was amazing. In fact, we've raised money overseas. I was speaking to Lord Deben, who heads up the British Climate Council, just a few days ago, and he said, "Oh, we can't have the Australians polluting our atmosphere, can we? I'll give you some money." You know. So you know, it's become a global issue. Yeah.
But for our audience tonight, when I was working in Australia, going to Canberra, what the Australian government had done had brought in a sustainable way all the elements related to climate change across the whole government. So this was an example for the world of trying to take the theory of sustainability to the climate change area and actually effectively doing it. And I think a Canadian was the first head of that. Was it Gwyn?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah,
And she was marvelous in terms of explaining to me, at least, how the whole thing. And so these events then are, from my point of view, are from an institutional point of view, then a kind of step backwards in terms of what we're doing.
Yeah, no, that's right. And as I said when we began, that the Australian political scene is very changeable, and it's with energy policy being a football in the political arena, policy changes, legislative changes are the last thing that business want to see.
Yeah.
They need that certainty, and regrettably, we don't have the stability that other parts of the world have had in this. So Europe, for example, where it's been, everyone's agreed things need to be done, and they've got on with the job quietly and done them. We're not like that, unfortunately. And I guess Canada, I don't know whether before the Conservative government came in, steps were being taken to deal with this, but yeah.
But I just want to finish up before we go to questions on the floor, and I'm just giving people a heads up. In 5 minutes or so, we want to move to the floor and get your questions and your insights. But can I turn in a personal sense? Because you must have had some times where you felt that you had been fiercely hurt by certain things, or other times when you must have felt a great sense of success, like your books, for instance, in connection with it and the world response to them. Any thoughts from a personal point of view on terms of what was best and what's been worst in terms of this remarkable career you've had?
Yeah, well, I must say that when I stood up 2 weeks ago to announce that we'd formed this new non-for-profit organisation, my heart was in my mouth, because I thought, if we raise $50,000 or $100,000, our collective careers are finished with this. The Australian public doesn't care.
Yes.
And so that was a moment of anxiety, and the gratification once we started to get that support was just fantastic. It really validated what we tried to do. And we all said as commissioners we'd do 6 months pro bono, so we're not taking a salary to do that. But that was wonderful. 12 months before that was some of the hardest times in my life, when the carbon tax was coming into play.
Yes.
We had a very dirty campaign by those who opposed us. Photographs of my house were published in the newspapers, along with defamatory stories, which I had to sue over. I had to have federal police protection because there was threats coming in for myself and at my home. So it's not like it's just at work, but it gets very personal when it involves your home. And I guess I took the view then that, it's a bit like a game we play in Australia called rugby. I don't know whether you're familiar with rugby.
And Australian rules rugby is far worse than the weaker version we have here.
Well, everyone who plays rugby, they've got a nose like this, or their ears are cauliflower, or whatever, the broken bones and stuff. Because the nature of the game is you grab the ball and then you run like buggery as fast as you can to try to get over a line at the end of the field, right? And every guy on the field is going to try to stop you. And they'll kick you, they'll pull you down, they'll do whatever they can to do it. But the climate thing's a bit like that, We've got the ball, we're running towards the try line, We've got to get there before we go through the 2-degree barrier. So that's the way I view it. So I expect to be kicked in the bloomin' privates, or pushed over or whatever, as you are in this. But you've got to forget that they're not the enemy. That's not who we're fighting. The objective is to cross that try line and make sure we get to that point where we've made the transition before we hit the danger zone in terms of climate change.
You must have had a tremendous sense of satisfaction to how well your books have done worldwide.
Yeah, I have, but I'm always surprised by them. When I wrote The Weathermakers, I really thought I was writing a kind of a primer for university students or high school students, but it obviously found a broader audience. So that has been really heartening. Yeah, it has.
And your last book, which I enjoyed immensely, did something that I thought was unique, or nearly unique. And that was bringing us back to the historical, to the cultural, the traditional aspects of what were involved in all of this. And I found that really useful, because there are times when we're going forward right now where it seems so many people are just looking in the rearview mirror. They're not looking forward. And that rearview mirror is a product of the fact that we tend to think in those it's a kind of constraint on moving forward, and inertia in connection with it.
That's
I
right.
thought, am I fair in trying to interpret your latest book in that way?
Yeah. Here on Earth really was an attempt to give that broader context, the evolutionary, societal, economic context we all operate in. And I think for me, it's stimulating and exciting to look into the future. I think for a lot of people it can be quite challenging though, particularly if you're in a conventional industry that's done well for a long time and you can't see a reason it might change. But
sure.
Things do change.
Just as a final question before we go to the audience, do you feel hopeful or do you feel discouraged from what you see?
Well, Bob, I had a little baby 3 months ago, so I reckon I've got to be encouraged, otherwise I'd be irresponsible. But yeah, look, I do feel encouraged. I think that if you'd asked me 3 years ago, I would have been much less certain.
Right.
But seeing this energy transition and the impact of the renewables, of particularly PV and wind,
right,
you see the power of those technologies to disrupt it. For me now, I feel like we're entering a period of immense creative destruction where the markets now are becoming very important, and that creative destruction of the marketplace is changing things dramatically. And I find it enormously stimulating and interesting, and it gives me the sense that yes, that's where the motive power, if you want, that we require to move our economies and societies forward. That's where it's going to come from. I always thought it would come from the market, but I couldn't see how it would. But now we can actually see the mechanism at work.
And I see some fundamental social changes beginning to push those market-driven forces as well. And the interaction between the two I see is so important right now in terms of looking to the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that societal change. And it came home very clearly to me when when our son was born, and I listened to his heartbeat. The doctor was listening, and I thought that there's every reason to think that heart will still be beating in 2100, and that little baby is one of 300,000 born in Australia this year, and we talk in an abstract way about climate change and impacts out to 2100. It's actually really real for me now, really concrete. There are people alive today who will experience that either catastrophic scenario or a far better future. And it depends on us now this decade. It's not something that's going to be delayed till next decade. It's actually right now that's important.
That's great. I'd like to just... we'd like to turn to the audience for another 45 minutes now of questions or comments from people. I would like to draw your attention to the fact to ask you to come to the microphone here. I would like to remind you that there are cameras here, so we are recording the kinds of comments for use of tides in the U of A in connection with this. This is not a matter that the CIA has infiltrated tides. I want to emphasize that. But I do want everyone to be aware of that. I would ask if you could keep your questions short so that they're focused on some of the main themes that we're trying to look at tonight. The microphones are now open, and if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself in terms of your question. Thank you.
Good evening. My name's Roger Gagne. I've been passionate about climate change for a long time, and in an effort to accelerate the debate in Canada, I started a website called carbonconversations.ca. It has a simple anonymous survey. I want all Canadians to chip in their 2 cents about climate change, whether they're climate hawks or climate skeptics, to engage people in that conversation. It's interactive so that the larger a word appears in the word cloud, the more often it's been used in the survey. There's a word cloud for postal codes. I want to see where people are across the country. So far, I've had about 400 responses. So my survey is just it's one of many things that happen, that need to happen, because there's this, bipolar is the word coming to mind. Sorry, that's not the right word. The debate is so polarized. That's what it is. It's really polarized. I'm sure you would have a better sense than I as to whether it's like that in other countries, but in North America, Canada, the US, people fall on two sides of the debate. There's a middle ground, of course, but so many people are like passionately for it, or oh my God, this is such a scam, it's a hoax. So can you speak to other strategies to try to bridge that debate, to try to get people involved regardless of where they stand?
Sure. Look, that's a really important question, and could I congratulate you on what you're doing with that website, which sounds important. But you know, you need to create a calm middle ground in order for people to be able to listen while the debate's very polarised. Not a lot of learning goes on, and it's very hard to start making progress in terms of giving people information. So at the Climate Commission in Australia, we're very much focused on remaining apolitical, simply providing information, and doing it in a calm, objective way that doesn't hype up into a sort of false debate, if you want, you know. And I think that is really important, because there is a huge middle ground there. There's a lot of people who may be casually interested in the subject, or maybe somewhat more interested, but who readily admit they don't have the facts that they need to make an informed decision. And that's the group we need to really get to. That's where civil society will come into its own once those people are engaged and understand and see the importance of these issues, I think.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Hi there, my name's Lou Mearns. I'm Métis. I believe in the 7 sacred arrows. Whatever we do today is going to affect 7 generations. We have a new type of wind turbine. It's not horizontal, not vertical. It's called EWAT, where we've taken out the centerpiece and it's magnet over coil. We got a city in Surrey that's accepted it, and it's engineered and it's going up. It's going to be the first net zero building with 3 250 kilowatt systems on the roof with a 500 kilowatt battery. So we're looking at places like Calgary, so we could put it on top of the roof here and power all the lighting here, and it is quiet. It has a housing on it so the birds and animals don't get in it. And so it's a new type of system that, as long as we got the money and effort to put towards it, it will be a thing of the future.
Wow.
Wow.
Impressive.
Do you have any urban wind power in Australia?
Almost none. It's almost all solar in Australia. We've got a very high quality solar resource, and it's cheap. Wind in Australia is mostly in the south, and it's large. It's 2 megawatt, 3 megawatt turbines, or 1.5 megawatt. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Brad. I'm a geek. I kind like to work with new technologies, and being a geek, I kind of use my personality as birth control. I send reach out to people and give them new feelings and thoughts. Looking at the shale oil boom, Australia has one of the top deposits in the world now, 10 times the amount of Saudi Arabia. China's funding it. We have the U.S. becoming an oil exporter, which they had their first oil export day as a nation a week ago. And with their 4 deposits of shale oil in the U.S., there's going to be no market for bitumen, which goes at $47.80 to produce, where Venezuela is selling at $40 US. We also have climate change actually taking place. So we're actually watching a collapse in our oil industries, the viability of it. And at the same time, we have cities like Calgary, which is in economic and environmental change, where they're predicting that the city of Calgary can only support 800,000 people with the current water problems coming. How are we going to be as a society able to handle these radical changes and creative destruction in our environments and marketplace, and how do we help people move their houses and locations to where they can sustainably live?
Well, they're really fundamental questions and very complex ones. And they're questions that you really should be asking your politicians, because they're making some of these decisions. And I think, it's really hard for me to advise on that, but what I can say is that you're absolutely right. We're entering a period of disruption, and I do think that there is vulnerability around the fossil fuel sector. It's not like it's going to disappear tomorrow, but we can see the constraints are increasing around it and the competition's increasing. And we can see that some of these things do collapse. I mean, If you know, I'd have told the Australian coal industry 5 years ago that 5 years from now, mate, your business for thermal coal is going to be finished, basically, under enormous stress, they wouldn't have believed me. They were still investing billions right up to the moment it happened.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And then now we've got stranded assets. We've wasted a lot of money. So, and we unfortunately haven't used that money that we gained from that industry to start preparing ourselves for the transition.
Is that the standard model? Do we have to have collapse for the change? Like the oil sands are going to be parked. Eventually it'll be worth money again. For 20, 30 years it's going to be parked. Is that creative destruction the only way that we make the changes in your experience?
I think in the market, in the free market, it seems to me the dominant paradigm is kind of like evolution. It's a survival, you know, parity well of the fittest type thing. But
Part of the difficulty, of course, we have is that we're one of the highest cost producers in the world. So when the price changes that our speaker was talking about earlier, then we would be one of the first to be impacted. I also want to come back to your issue on water, because when I was involved with the National Roundtable, one of the most discouraging aspects, because we wrote 2 or 3 really major reports on water resources, availability, quality, and the natural resource industries. And it was very discouraging the degree to which everyone privately in the political sector agreed that this was a tremendously difficult, this was tremendously significant to the whole economic future, urban development and other things. But they said, please don't expect, I'll talk about this publicly, that the issue of water in Alberta politically was so charged with emotion that with the exception of a couple of environment ministers that we've had in the last 10 years, they've all just stayed away from it. And there are some very important people at work privately in southern Alberta trying to look at this stuff, and we really need to have a kind of public dialogue on climate change and water, because I think it's so critical.
We just had the collapse of the Gulf Stream in Mexico through the BP disaster. The Gulf Stream's not moving hot water to England, which is causing the flooding and things that we've been experiencing. Why hasn't that information hit the news? Why are we so reluctant to talk about the truth and the reality of climate changes that have taken place and are taking place?
I can't answer your question. Maybe we should redirect it to some of the press barons. There's a particular style of reporting on some of this, which is, but once again, it comes back to some of these issues of complexity too in terms of what they're doing. Could I turn to the next speaker, please?
Yes, thank you. My name is David Dunsmore, and my question is to do with human overpopulation, because it was 2 years ago this month that we hit the 7 billion mark, which I find shocking. I mean, even I'm old enough to remember when we hit 5 billion in the 80s, and I thought that was way crazy. So every time I hear about, you know, new innovations, new efficiencies, things, I think, great, we need all that. But to me, in a few years' time, exponential growth of human population is going to, you know, put all that good to no use. And by the end of this century, who knows where we'll be, 10, 12 billion. But sooner or later, Mother Nature's going to sort us out if we don't sort ourselves out. So how are we going to come to terms with this huge overpopulation, despite all the humanitarian, religious, and so on reasons why we can't tell people to stop at 1 or 2 kids?
look, the population issue, it is a critically important one globally. You know, it's, what can I say? It's one of those problems that we know how to fix, but we don't seem to want to do it. The fix is really easy. What you've got to do is give, particularly women in developing countries, autonomy over their own bodies and greater economic prosperity. You know, if you give them something to lose, we know, we see it in one country after the other, the economic transition, demographic transition sees birth rates drop. While poverty and despair proliferate, population's going to proliferate too. So we do know how to fix it. We've got to do it through foreign aid, you know, increasing our foreign aid in those areas. But having said that, you can look at those UN projections and see, if you look at them in detail, they're not quite as despairing as they might appear. You know, the UN revisits the population growth issue every 2 years, the biennial projections. The latest ones show that obviously the rate of of increase is going to start slowing, and we might be at 9.3 billion by 2050, and after that there's a prospect that will start either steady or start to decline. So, and policy means everything in this area. You know, if we did increase our foreign aid budgets, eradicate poverty and so forth, we might cap at 8 billion. You know, if we do less in that area, we might be up at 10 billion. So the future is very much in our hands with this. We know what the fixes are. We can see what the projections are. There's not a, I don't think we can, there's no case for despair, but there is a case for urgent action.
Right, because we're going to need the courage to have this conversation globally, because to me, population is the elephant in the room, because people in the developing world are the ones having the most kids, and of course, as soon as they get a TV, they see how developed people live, and they all want to have SUVs or whatever, like most of us.
That's right, and that's where technology comes in, because you know, if you have the SUVs made of renewable materials running on biofuels, maybe it's not so bad. At least the impacts are reduced, or maybe you don't, you know. Actually, that's a facile thing to say. I'm going to take that back, because really, what people want is transport. They want to get around, right? So they don't necessarily want SUVs, and you know, but they do want the option to get from A to B, and that's what has to be provided as a decent quality of life for anyone.
Absolutely, because my fear is that Mother Nature is going to sort us out if we don't sort ourselves out first.
Oh, that's absolutely true.
The stock market spikes, people say, oh, the stocks are overpriced. Then there's a bit of a momentary crash, and they say, oh, well, you know, it's a market correction. Well, I think we're in for a population correction, and it's going to be by means we don't like. Wars, famine, climate events.
I covered this in, I won't go on and on about it, but I did cover it in my new book, Bob, when I talked about that, and just said that we are the only species in the history of the planet that's escaped the Malthusian paradox, potentially. We self-regulate our population, you know, going through the demographic transition. Countries like Canada are at replacement rate, or even a bit below many of the developed countries of the world. So it's a really weird thing, but we've actually got it within us to solve this problem. We're the only species on the whole planet that has it.
That's right.
We've just got to pick up the tools and do it.
And yet our whole economic system is built on growth, growth, growth. No one's going to sell more stocks if their pledge is we're not going to sell any more next year than we did this year, or that we're going to decline in a slow pattern. I mean, nobody would buy that stock. Nobody would invest in that company. So
anyway, I'd like to get to some of the other. Thanks very much for your question, an excellent one. Please go ahead.